Hello and welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Natalie Bell, and I'm curator at the List Visual Arts Center at MIT, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to our panel discussion today with artists Sung Tieu and Keller Easterling and Meltzer. This panel, titled When Structures Govern, is aiming to take a closer look at the legibility of infrastructure in the built environment, at the intersection of conceptualism and structuralism, particularly in visual art since the 60s. And among all these ideas, the place of humanism and humans within the manifold systems that govern and organize our lives. We are going to start a slideshow during my brief introduction so that you can get some visuals of Sung's exhibitions, both at the List Center, which you're seeing now, and Amant in Brooklyn. Both exhibitions center Sung's research of both physical and psychological realms that are articulated through space and architectural elements. Our talk today is co-hosted by the List Center and Amant in Brooklyn, and I want to thank everyone who contributed to today's program, particularly Isabella Nemo at Amant, Emily Garner and Tessa Haas at the List, as well as our AV tech at MIT. And I'm also grateful to Ruth Estevez, the director and chief curator at Amant, who joins us today and will moderate the panel conversation. And I also want to thank our panelists for working with us to reschedule our program, and to thank everybody joining us for bearing with our change of plans and rejoining us today. We will have about an hour for a conversation. We may have time for some questions. So if you have any, please feel free to send them through the chat feature, and we will do our best to address them if we do have a chance to. Since you can read fuller bios on our event page, I will just introduce our panelists pretty briefly here, and then say a few words about the respective exhibitions just to contextualize our conversation today in relation to these recent works by Sung Tieu. Keller Easterling is a writer and designer and is the Enid Storm Dwyer Professor of Architecture at Yale. Her books include Medium Design from 2021, Extra Statecraft, The Power of Infrastructure Space from 2014, and Subtraction from 2014, among others. I'm just mentioning a few. Keller's scholarship in Extra Statecraft particularly interested us as a way of thinking about infrastructure space in relation to governance, and thinking of nested forms of sovereignty in space, space and infrastructure as types of information systems. Meltzer is an associate professor of visual studies at the Gallatin School at NYU, and is affiliated with the Department of Art History at NYU as well. And we were very impressed with Eve's book, Systems We Have Loved, Conceptual Art, Affect, and the Anti-Humanist Turn, published by University of Chicago Press in 2013. And the scholarship in this book is very interesting in that it situates the conceptual art movement, both in relationship to structuralist thought, but also ideas of affect, which intersects with Sung's work as well. And Sung Tieu is an artist who lives and works in Berlin. And in addition to her solo shows that are currently up at the List Center and at Amant, she has had recent solo shows at Kunstmuseum Bonn, Nottingham Contemporary, Hofstra Munich, and many others that are actually too many to name here. Her artistic strategies are quite wide-ranging, but often engage structuralism, information, architecture, bureaucracy, sound, and space. Sung's List Center show, which is on view through mid-July, is titled Civic Floor. And in brief, it's really looking at space through a number of sculptures and translations of documents that are on view. The exhibition, well, I'm going to speak about Amant since this is what we're seeing right now on these slides. The exhibition at Amant holds a number of different bodies of work. In particular is a new commission titled Liability Infrastructure that I think will be exciting to unpack in this space here today. The exhibition generally, I would say, is looking at different forms of spectral knowledge and relationships to infrastructure. What you're seeing in this slide right here is the work called Mural for America. And this is a mural composed of stainless steel plaques, 1,900 of them, that are each engraved with the name of a different chemical ingredient that's used in the hydraulic fracking process. And this is the subject of course, a great deal of research on Sung's part to uncover these chemical components and an interest both in the infrastructure and the legal infrastructures around the way knowledge about these very chemicals is even accessible at all. Going back to the List Center exhibition, the main sculptural pieces on view are very large stainless steel works that are referencing different forms of prison architecture that have been utilized throughout the last 2 centuries. Both exhibitions have a strong sound component, and this comes into play in thinking around the role of affect in relation to conceptual and minimalist strategies. The sound works are very, very different, but they do create a sort of ambient sound that has a very effective and visceral and bodily impact for visitors in the spaces. And that's the one thing that's really tricky to translate in a slideshow or Zoom presentation. Some of the other works on view at Amant are thinking about Cold War histories and their place today. Various psychological tactics developed during the Cold War, like acoustic warfare, have a place in a more recent phenomenon known as the Havana syndrome. And that's an entire area of research of Sung's that is articulated through a number of works on view at Amant. We're back here to the List Center, and the works that you're seeing here are titled Grid Form. These are plaster tablets that are encased in plexiglass and framed with a white linen. And beneath each one is another stainless steel plaque. And as you see this grouping here, this is kind of one-to-one translation of bureaucratic form, in particular one that would be used for a type of asylum application. And what Sung has done with that form is removed all of the language from it. So what remains visible on this office paper-sized page is just grids and boxes and lines. And then what is literally enumerated in the stainless steel plaque below those is the square millimeters that's available in each of the grids and lines. So you can see these list bars, blocks, boxes, cells. So in this sense, these works are taking a very analytic and conceptual approach to understanding space, but also thinking through the way space informs the types of stories that can be told in these asylum applications, and relating that type of bureaucratic form to architecture itself by making these works that exist on the wall and that use the raw material of architecture in the plaster itself. So with that, I hope I can have laid a little bit of ground contextualizing these recent works. And yeah, just to kick off the conversation, I wanted to open with a line. I was thinking about a few different things, but was just struck by a line from Keller's Extra Statecraft book about the ideological stories that accompany infrastructural space. And so much of your work is addressing ideology's relationship to infrastructural space. So even these sculptures you see here that are showing you basically a floor plan of a prison design, that is a type of infrastructural space that has its own ideology baked into that architectural design. That's something that you've been thinking about. And Keller, you also write about how gossip and rumor and hoax are these tools for destabilizing power. And Sung, I want to bring this back to the works at Amant too, where there's this connection between something that Keller is citing, which is a type of greenwashing that happens where oil companies, for example, are sort of using a greenwashing kind of ideology to speak about the work that they're doing. And Sung, you encountered that too in your research around fracking. So I would just love to leave it at that and maybe hear from both of you about your concerns around these intersections of ideology and infrastructure, and the extent to which rumor or gossip can be destabilizing tools, or if they can also be further tools for the abuse of power. So do you want to tackle that first and tell us a little bit about what you encountered in your fracking research, particularly in relation to sort of greenwashing or co-opting of these ideas around green energy? Mm-hmm. I'm thinking specifically about the Ohio governor, just to be more specific.
Yes, so part of the exhibition at Amant is the installation liability infrastructure, and I have a series of works that are called Newspapers 1969 Ongoing that are sort of like constantly, I constantly contextualize certain exhibitions through writing, essentially. So what I encountered during my research for the Amant exhibition was that, I think that was in March, that Ohio Governor DeWine legally classified fracking as quote unquote green energy or renewable energy. So the title of the newspaper is "There's Green Gas in Ohio State." So what DeWine did was to release under a bill titled the Chicken Bill. He passed two laws to basically classify fracking as green energy, but also to allow there to be fracking on Ohio state parks. And that was sort of done without public review. So what happened was that, it was under a different bill, which was about chickens and eggs. And they, in the last minute, also passed these two bills related to fracking. And the article actually talks more about how that information was released. So I'm talking more about the Friday news dump, the phenomena of the Friday news dump, that when you have news that you need to announce to the public, but you don't really want to, or you understand that that might be unpopular to release that information, you do that Friday afternoon when everyone is leaving the office, and sort of your Google alerts and other alerts don't come up as much, so you can release that information, hopefully with not many people noticing. So I think that specific text is really interested in language and how, of course, language is being used, ranging from obviously natural gas and green energy, and how the legal categorization of fracking as green energy, which is actually inspired by an EU law. So DeWine actually didn't come up with that. That was actually the EU. How that obviously has a lot of actual implications, but also implications on the perception of, that type of energy for the entire society.
Yes, I mean, I'm in Sung's work as in my work too, trying so hard to make infrastructures palpable, to say that, yes, sometimes they are buried under the ground as pipes and wires, but they're also often the sort of protocols and rules that are surrounding you, that you're swimming in, and the liability infrastructure is doing that in sort of a marvelous way, in the sense that you're in the gallery, you're seeing an expose of different aspects of fracking, but you're also feeling the vibrations. You're also aware that there is, a pipe X feet below your feet outside that room, so sort of starting to project outside the gallery this palpable world. And I suppose some of what my work might be doing to link arms with Sung's work is to make palpable those dispositional layers of the world that are not lexical, that are not quantifiable, that aren't about just knowing that, like knowing the right answer or knowing the name for something, but knowing an information system that has to do with proximities as they register in spaces and solids and bodies. And the reason for that is, not only to more thoroughly expose the dangers of these infrastructures, but to contrast the ways in which political superbugs, like DeWine or Senator Inhofe, when he, called the climate change a hoax, so he was making a hoax on top of a hoax, like these political superbugs are good at scrambling lexical expressions. They're good at taking ideologies and flipping them between the left and the right. They don't care, it's all to harvest loyalties and to play with temperaments. So somehow to expose the way in which they're using gossip, not as a weapon of the weak, as James C. Scott would describe it, but as the sort of slippery tools of political superbugs and political power, somehow to be able to sort of see both the physical, palpable infrastructures and the slippery, conflated, scrambled ideologies as separate things. Something that I'm working hard to do, but culture seems often always to give faith to the quantitative expression and the lexical expression, no matter what.
I wanted to ask, since we're talking about infrastructures, Sung, the title Infra-Specter, I kept trying to wrap my brain around what a specter beneath, what a ghost underneath, right? How the replacement of structure with specter, how you were thinking about that. I mean, I can see it in so many of the works, a kind of ghostly, kind of not fully locatable, not even something that can't totally be known, but there's a sense that there's something we are being told. Thinking, for example, of the brain MRIs, where we're clearly in the presence of information and we have the feeling of we're being shown something. Nonetheless, we have really no idea what it is, other than that gesture of, right? And so I see ghosts there. I see things that are coming and going. And I wonder if you have thoughts about the replacement of structure with specter.
Yeah. I think the ghost is reoccurring in my work. I think that's actually one of the longest, maybe, themes that span across, a lot of research, because it started off with ghost tip number 10, that is, has sort of mutated into a research about Havana syndrome, And yes, also what Keller mentioned about, literally the pipeline infrastructure below our feet, or the, the chemical ingredients that are pumped, into the ground to extract frack gas that we don't know about. So for me, the ghost in many ways represents, yes, an element of the unknown. On the one hand, I think that also links back to gossip, or narration and narrative, and how narrative influence the way we look at those ghosts. I mean, in some way, I think the ghost can be haunting, but also it can be not be taken seriously. I think there's something of both, that you can interpret in relation to the ghost. So I think in regards to fracking, what is interesting is also there's a great acceptance for fracking, right, in the United States. So I think what really interests me was to reveal the information and to see what that might do, I think, or how that might affect the way we perceive, or how the public opinion would perhaps shift, perhaps not. And I think that's also what I'm doing about the Havana syndrome research, is to show different information. So within the exhibition, actually, the set of information changes after half of the exhibition. So in the first half, I'm showing information that is quite critical towards Havana syndrome. And that shifts in June, I think 18th of June. And the second set of information is much more affirmative to Havana syndrome. And hopefully that also changes the way we read those brain scans, because obviously, the idea around the brain scan is that I exposed myself to a reconstruction of Havana syndrome. But what you mentioned, Eve, about brain scans themselves is, when I spoke to scientists about the brain scans, is the way you can read a brain scan is actually really, really difficult, right? Unless it's a very obvious tumor or a very obvious damage. To locate psychological damage, so to speak, is very difficult to do. That's almost impossible to do. All you can do is show certain active parts of the brain and interpret what those active parts mean, and the effects they might have on the brain. But yeah, in those MRI scans, you can't fully understand the actual impact.
Yeah, I when I saw those, I couldn't help but think of Robert Morris's self-portrait EKG, which are so different, but where he produced an EKG of his brain, I think that's what it's called, while thinking of himself, for the time it took for the lines to inscribe his body's height. So they're profoundly ironic, Duchampian, what have you. This is not descriptors I would add to your work, but nonetheless, I just was interested in that offering of information, that gesture, that somehow something could become known, inscribed, captured, informationalized in response to something that on the one hand seems quite apparent, yet has been denied and dissimulated in all sorts of ways. But what I was interested in is the effect it has on the viewer and what one feels when you're encountering it. Yeah.
Maybe one thing I can say about that is also, when I exhibited Havana syndrome for the first time in 2020, it was quite contentious to show information that was critical of Havana syndrome, because you immediately enter a sort of Cold War discussion. At the time, 2020, it was really affirmative. Like, the media was very much about Havana syndrome happened. This is what happened to the victims. This is what occurred. These are the, ailments the victims had, and the brain concussions that came with it. And that really shifted. I mean, I think in 2023, we look at it very differently, because there was a report that came out in the Washington Post by the intelligence agencies doubting that it was a foreign force behind Havana syndrome. They said it was very, quote unquote, unlikely that it was a foreign force. And so somehow, you know, the story behind Havana syndrome really shifted and changed, and it became a lot more accepted and maybe less scary, so to speak, to expose yourself to a reconstruction of it. But I think that is also very much part of the exhibition, right? How public opinion can shift. And I think in some way that's also really interesting in relation to fracking, that hopefully, and I think it is already shifting as well, as for instance, Colorado in July would change the law to oblige the companies to reveal all ingredients involved in fracking. It remains to be seen whether they are going to do it and how they're going to do it. But yeah, it does have an impact somehow.
I don't know if this is a very good segue, but one of the things I think about in liability infrastructure is just how I mean, one of the things which I would want to take from it and you can continue to use is just the excesses of a corruption, you know, just what a lot of trouble corruption really is, you know, like it's a lot of work, you know, to like be that corrupt, to have, you know, to go through even just the legal processes of that many chemicals, you know, that you're going to try to protect, like the 2 miles that the pipes go down into the earth and the 2 miles they go in either direction, 4 miles and miles and miles and miles, you know, the excessive nature of this apparatus, you know, not only physically, but in its kind of, in the kind of bureaucracy surrounding it. That's one like really wonderful thing about the work that you're doing, and you kind of fantasize about the bureaucrat that's doing that work, or about the bureaucrat that's organizing you know, a kind of TSA style picture of your body. And you imagine that bureaucrat, you know, doesn't actually know where their spleen is, you know, their own spleen or stomach, the sort of squishy, wet information that is going to be part of their body for the whole of their lives. Somehow it's like the bureaucratic naming and quantifying is more real, you know, to them.
Can I jump in too, and just to stick on liability infrastructure for a second? I think what's really important about this work is that it's calling out the role of our legal system in the US and the infrastructure that our legal system is, in the sense that what is protected through our legal system, and how it itself can be used to obscure or obfuscate things through certain types of protections. So, you know, Sung, there's all these chemicals that you list, and they're ordered alphabetically, but then, you know, you get to a point where they're just numeric, and the sort of withholding of information, making it a sort of a trade secret, basically, means that these chemicals and the people using them are protected from liability, meaning they're protected from anybody who's going to maybe file a future lawsuit or seek damages because of anything that has resulted because of the fracking or the chemicals. They're protected because their intellectual property is protected, because their trade secret is protected. So in a way, it's exposing also how the entire legal system becomes a shield And, there's this nesting that happens where companies are using these kind of legal loopholes, more or less, to shield themselves from liability. And it's more about that than actually protecting a copyright. So I don't know, I just wanted to mention that that was something very profound that to me that came out of that work, was understanding how different facets of the legal system are leveraged to basically shield these companies from liability, which also to me reads as an acknowledgement of guilt.
This is such a frightening area because when you figured out the law of exception that allows the law not to be able to touch you, so you've placed yourself in another sort of insulated, as you say, nested package, then how does activism work? Can it only then work at a legal level with legal language? How do you get back to another information system that is physical, that confronts that apparatus with some other force? And I do see so many attempts to make those other information systems palpable in Sung's work.
Yeah, I think that's an important question in terms of how this feeds into activism. If it does, how do we claw back our right to access that information? How do we claw back the ability to have any knowledge around the chemicals that are used in the environment around us? And thinking, to tie this back to some of your work, Eve, I think I wonder if you want to say a little bit about information very broadly as something that was formative or informative for a number of artists who were, let's say, early figures in conceptual art, as you've identified it, and how some of their work might translate into a project like this, or what we've gleaned from the types of ways they introduced thinking about information and systems.
Mm-hmm. I guess, well, first I might just throw in that I guess before I ask the relationship between Sung's work and activism, I ask the relationship between the subject matter at hand and just representation and her representational strategies. So, in my book, it was a result of becoming interested in the ways that early conceptualists both mobilize kind of the aesthetics of structure and systematicity and information, and also sort of sought to escape it, to critique it, to find some sort of space and relationship to it. So looking at the show, at least at Amant, I was interested in how that relationship manifests in Sung's work, particularly your drive to kind of know, to uncover, even if sometimes what we are seeing is just the surface of things. I mean, I'm thinking of, in cold print, for example, we just sort of get the stories that we're told. We don't really get much beneath that. But I see you sort of believing and kind of laying things bare. Again, back to Mural for America. You've done an enormous amount of research, and it seems that what we come to know is a bunch, unless I missed something, of very difficult to pronounce names of chemicals, substances that we did not know, that I suppose we could have known if we had put the number of hours into that you have. And really what we get is this kind of unsettling combination of affects, right? So I'm thinking, I just wrote down one name, ethoxyloth. So, I mean, you can't even say this, xyloxyethyl acetate. And they're not, you haven't ordered them as like a periodic table of elements or something like that. This is more of a, you call it a mural. To me, it's almost a kind of corporate memorial. So there's like sadness there, there's care there, but there isn't care because it's really kind of cold and it's sterile. There's certainly death. And then there's this utter alienation of these names, which there's the suggestion that somehow they're getting inside our bodies and we should care and know, but we really don't know what they are. I mean, you know, and again, at least as far as I'm concerned, I can hardly pronounce them. Maybe you know what they are. So that's an interesting combination of emotional registers that are being produced. And it's cold, but it's not dry. And so I guess in my book, I'm interested in kind of the affective elements of a early informational or form of art making that was interested both in information and systems and structures. And I was particularly interested in a kind of discursive theoretical field of structuralism, not, in other words, systems and structures could point to many things, but that was my focus, was this kind of what was ultimately a kind of epistemological tactic, the work of various structuralists who thought, well, if we just turn to language, we can really see everything and know everything and tackle all fields. And so I was interested in thinking about how these artists had turned to information. And often it's work that we tend to think of as disaffected, but in fact, emotion and affect is right there. But yeah, so that just leads me to want to ask, I guess, Sung, if you could say something about your sense of your own aesthetic sensibilities, your own kind of tactics or strategies that you lean on, sometimes auditory, sometimes invisible, sometimes visible, and how they kind of function, as a kind of, yeah, I don't know that I would call it informational. To me, the word doesn't quite capture it, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
I think that's quite a difficult question for an artist because
maybe it's unfair.
because
we could always leave it as, I think it's it was fascinating for me to think about terrain that you're touching into and how you seek to represent it.
Yes, I think it's also something that is shifting. If you look at in-code print from 2020 and liability infrastructure from 2023, the way I've done it is, I would say, vastly different. In-code print really looks at the news screen and how information and how narrative through journalistic writing conveys a sort of conclusion, or implies a sort of conclusion, by just revealing sort of facts and combining them together to make the reader conclude whatever you want them to conclude. Whereas I think liability infrastructure somehow feels more personal. It really includes the domestic space in a different way. Also, the way I used jars and the collection of water, and they are not really classified or categorized or named from where they are from, but just collecting water in general. Of course, they were mostly from those fracking sites, but I think, more and more I'm interested in collecting any types of water, really. But the way that is sort of like displayed within, this actually, it's a book lending cabinet that I saw around New York, to, you know, a children's truck or toy with, you know, wood collected from around Amant. I think it's a very different strategy of connecting sort of the coldness of the infrastructure that surrounds us. Although you have the pipeline, but then the way the sound comes out of the pipe is actually quite delicate and, you know, sensorial. It's a vibration, but it's not that harsh. I think it's ghostly and, you know, maybe slightly terrifying, but it's not really intended to. It's just literally what I recorded from around the sites. So I think I'm moving more and more towards maybe adding a more personal reading of the type of information through including maybe a more domestic scene. I think you have sort of the rocking chairs, one of a child and one of an adult, with a newspaper on it. So it really creates a very different scene. Like the way I started perhaps with in cold print was much more, sticking to the information, sticking to sort of governmental structures. And that is sort of moving into a different direction, which is maybe, smaller scale and or incorporating smaller scale type works that look into the domestic and the personal. Yes,
I can see that now that you mention it. There's a way that you're pointing to, particularly in the later work, how the human is disavowed or denied or otherwise oppressed. I mean, you really feel it in the letter, broken words, false measures. This is addressed to someone, but it's so bureaucratic and painful. And so somehow that humans is very much conjured in that room. Whether it's those chairs or the kind of very careful collecting of water with domestic objects, you know, those jars, it's sort of faintly recognized. And also just, I thought that sound was actually pretty painful. To be in the presence of. So there, I can see that you're shifting to sort of moving away from sort of the informational, from the textual, and a little bit more towards how to maybe make the specter of the human live in the room.
From the perspective of the audience, if I can jump in here, like, because I have been talking with a lot of people that has been experiencing the exhibition, like both body of works, but mostly liability infrastructure. People feel really in a situation of discomfort, like really hunted. Actually, has been like something that even if it's very subtle and everything, like they feel like it's like perhaps it's the ghost of this information that is revealed through the data, because I think what is interesting for me to see is like most of the work of Sung is always about this amount of data, no? And data is information. Actually, you have access to the information, and then it doesn't matter because this is too overwhelming that you will never understand what is there. So even if the government will answer the letter explaining you what is in your water, I mean, you will not have the knowledge to identify what actually is in the water. But definitely, like, I mean, perhaps it's because of the sound component that is so important in the work of Sung. It's like an invisible presence that is there. And actually now when I am in the gallery, I sometimes I run, you know, like I feel like the ghost is coming behind me, like transforming this idea of like a ghostly information. So.
Sung, I wonder if you want to reflect a little bit about the place of sound in these installations. It is so distinctive.
Yes.
And so powerful. I mean, we've also had comments from visitors, people moved to tears, like really just emotionally crippled by their encounter with the space. And it's has to do with the sound. It absolutely does. So, I would be curious to hear you reflect on why, because there's so many artists who do use sound, but often it's isolated or it's treated as an artwork that needs to be somehow in a separate space, encountered on its own, and not in tandem with other artworks. So I would be really curious to hear how, you've gone from doing installations that have sound as a kind of sculptural component, to thinking about the sound as somehow environmental, but very much part of a installation or exhibition space.
I often use sound to sort of, well, depends on the exhibition, but I think at Civic, for Civic Floor at MIT, the sound is really a contrast to the sculptures and to these plastic cast work, because the sculptures are really austere and imposing and oppressive in some way, and I think the sound does exactly the opposite of that. It is an emotional response to how it might feel to be in that space, or I think I used a lot of heartbeat, for instance, right? Or sort of vibrations as well, brain waves, part of the sound. So in some way, for Civic Floor, the sound really sets it off into a totally different direction that you probably wouldn't expect. If you see the images, I think you couldn't really guess how the sound actually works, because it is completely going two ways. And at Amant, I think I try to stick to just more, to the field recording and to what I actually encountered. And I just basically, the only thing I played was subs. So there was subwoofer, basically direct sound, or subwoofer noise. So that's all I did, is to use the actual recording that I took from various fracking sites, and and then play them again in the space. But of course, it's speculating on the vibrational notion that comes with the sound, and obviously the factories that are around those sites. So really, depending on the exhibition, I use sound very differently. Sometimes it's very honest to a source material, and other times it's really composed and really trying to capture you, on an affect level. And that has been a great interest of mine, because I come from a sort of conceptual interest in the visual language of art, and somehow sound allows me to do what maybe Eve is talking about in her book, is to include affect and all its facets, but not directly in the work itself. I think I don't really express myself, I don't do gestural painting, for instance, but I do that somehow with sound, those gestures.
I think affect is there certainly with sound. I mean, I found moving target shadow detection also kind of intolerable to be in the space with the sound. Really just both of those, the auditory experience, both of those rooms. But I also think it's also in the invisibility of some things. Protective cover, I didn't even know that I saw it. It's the use of these elements in the work that are maybe part of the architecture, maybe they have a kind of infrastructural function within the architecture, and they don't always announce themselves as part of the work. And then you sort of know that they're there, and you see them and you think, what is that barely visible element, that has a profound, I think, affective impact. So it's interesting to have this overwhelming auditory element and then these very subtle, I call them almost invisible because I sometimes didn't catch them. And then there's this sort of suggestion, what are they leaching, or, you know, how does this connect to the chemicals, or how does this connect to nausea, or this transient, hard to locate effect of something deeper?
Yeah, I think for Amant, I also was for the first time interested in using the transient spaces of the galleries. So, you know, the corridors, I mean, we discussed actually using the bathroom. That was not possible. But yes, to kind of not make a distinction between what is an official gallery space and what are the transient spaces, you know, obviously, okay, the courtyard as well, but I think the lobby area was something that I was really interested in using. And to sort of, yeah, doubt the hierarchies of that. I think that was more artistically something that I was really interested in using and continue to actually think about, you know, what are actually the sanitary facilities look like and why not make work there? I think, yeah, to turn the gallery space, also the infrastructure of the gallery space upside down was something that I was curious in exploring.
It's always I mean, I think that the inescape continuity of the sound and that it is inescapable even in the corridor, or is part of the terror of it. And you know, outside of the gallery too, the terror of these organizations that seem so immense and so continuous and so well insulated from any alteration is terrifying. I mean, I think it's whistling through the graveyard, American expression, but for what it's worth, there's also, for me, the absurdity and insanity of them are also exposed, so that there's at least a hope that there's something weak and friable about these organizations that seem so far out of our hands, but that you might somehow get into your hands, or that you know two can play at this game of tricking and hoodwinking and manipulating and corrupting.
We just have a few comments coming in, and one of them I think is something that we've touched on already, but just to acknowledge, someone is writing that the multiplicity of opaque industry names and obscure abbreviations for chemicals is a significant obstacle to researchers who are trying to understand their effects, and just the opaque names, let alone the types of intellectual property protections that you've called out in your mural, really fragment attempts to both collect information and to organize. So just going back to that, it is incredibly frustrating, but also powerful in the sense that your work brings that to light, and begins to give us more information around what it is that's obscuring our ability to research these and to have more knowledge and understanding. Yeah, does anyone have any last closing thoughts? Well, thank you so much, Eve and Keller and Sung. and Ruth and Emily. It's been a real pleasure to have us all together here and to think through all of these less than joyful subjects, but important ones together. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you for
Thank you.
in this conversation.